sub-elements. And so what does that mean? So we extend on that previous simple explanation on populate, and now we've got shall be capable of providing at least one of the sub-element values. And that's the responder's obligation. So in this case, you might just populate the text sub-element. But this bit gets a little bit more difficult when you're the requester. So you shall be capable of processing all sub-elements. So you have to be able to not error if you receive a time or an author reference or an author string as well as the text. You need to be able to support all four of those elements without error. Just bear with me for a sec. Okay, so if we move into something like, just as another example, the subject is a reference. So it's got sub-elements of reference, type, identifier, and display. So from a responder's perspective, they only have to support one of those. You can choose whether you want to support the reference sub-element, the identifier sub-element, or potentially the display sub-element. But from a requester's perspective, you have to support all of those without error. Okay, moving on to some optional elements now. So note is an example of an optional element. And if we think about, look at the definitions that go beyond the basic populate requirements, now we've got shall not include an element in the resource returned as part of the query results when the element is optional. I think that I might have stuffed that up, sorry.
Sanjeet has his hand up here.
Sanjeet.
So based on your last slide, what you're saying is must support has a stricter enforcement on the requester.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's subjective to a degree, because still the kind of restriction is shall no error.
Correct.
So I think it's a bit swings and roundabouts. It's not as difficult, I think, an obligation to meet as shall populate is on the responder, but yes. So I think the requester has to be able to accept the resource if it has any valid element, basically.
So if your client is expecting the reference sub-element, but you receive and you're able to leverage that reference, that URL, but you receive an identifier, you can't do much with that, but you can't not raise an error. You can't fall over.
So perhaps a way of describing it is that the obligation is broader but less onerous.
Yes. Now you can reject resources. That's still within the you shall no error. You've accepted, you've got these, you have processed them sufficiently that you know whether or not they meet your requirements to go further and use them for your business.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because if it's containing any valid value, if the identifier is a valid value, you shall.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that you have to, if what you need in order to do something, okay, hang on. We can get into this one with, if, for example, you are, I'm sorry, Sanjeet, I see your hands up. if your business is to process a resource and you process it and you need a particular sub-element in order to work, and in your profile you have constrained that, and that's what you publish and state, you're expected to, yes, it shall be no error, but you can still process and filter out the things that you can't use. You've not thrown an error.
What sort of errors are these counting? So if I accept the resource and then say, and then raise in some sense a profile error against my own personal profile, which says, you haven't sent me a reference, so I'm going to reject that. In some sense, that's an error, but that's not an error for the purposes of this statement. So perhaps we need
Correct.
some clarification around which errors count for this purpose and which errors don't count for this purpose.
So if you do it as a downstream profile and you say that the references must support, the reference sub-element is must support, then yeah, you are now stating something that is more tight than what AU core does.
If like if we read the rest of the description, because obviously we've taken an extract of no error, it does say that applications are able to inform the user that a value cannot be processed correctly and may ignore the data. And so they just aren't able to reject an instance merely because it's present.
Correct.
And sorry, Sanjeet, did you want to?
Sorry, just thinking from a, again, use case perspective. So from a FHIR server perspective, as long as I just need to support one of those sub elements, right? But from a client perspective, which might be interacting with multiple FHIR servers, I would have to ensure I'm ready to accept, means I should be able to handle. Does not mean I need to, how do I say, process data provided by a sub element, but I should be able to handle it and not throw an error.
So handle is a tricky term to use in this context because it has actually got a very specific meaning in FHIR. And it is actually the next level of obligation down from no error, where you are actually supposed to do something with it. It doesn't say what you're going to do with it, because there are then further sub types of that, such as print, display, persist, etc. So I just want to stay away from that term handle. And that's kind of the trick here, that we're trying to actually leverage those terms so that we have a common understanding of the terms that we're using and their meaning. But it really is what Danielle has pointed out there, that applications aren't able to reject an instance merely because the element exists. So as a client, you can't push back on that. Now, it is tricky if we start thinking about it from a downstream profile perspective, because if a client says you must support the reference sub-element, then are you core compliant?
I think so. It does allow here that violate specific business rules, and I think there has to be the expectation that you can get further constrained.
So if a server provides them with a identifier and no reference, yet the client is stated downstream, and maybe we need to stop right here. We're going down a rabbit hole. Again, we're into interpretation here, but I would actually say you're not AU core compliant as the client.
Then
If
what about
you
that
say
bullet
that
point?
must support is on reference a sub-element. because you're not supporting the other sub-elements such as identifier.
Okay, I don't agree because of that bullet point that said that it may raise an error if it violates the business rules. And your business rules are saying you need references, not displays, not identifiers. You need this. And so you can go back and say, no, I can't process this because it doesn't meet the business rules that I need.
I think we need some
Fair enough.
clarification of what erroring and not erroring means. Because it might be, we've got a couple of concepts of erroring and not erroring in mind, in the back of our mind.
Again, reading that again, I think Daniel's probably right. It is not rejecting merely because the element is present, but if it is in violation to your profile, then you're allowed to reject it because of the second dot point. I think the clarification is there.
So if I want to reject stuff, I have to construct a profile that allows me, that advertises my grounds for rejection.
But to even reject stuff, we need to be able to acknowledge stuff.
Well, I mean, business rules come in multiple manners. So a business rule may be a profile. It may be other business rules that aren't stated in your profile. And I know some systems that do that. They have an element of profile validation, but then they have additional business rules that are over and above that.
Your interpretation of the business rules defined in some narrative are potentially appropriate. So doesn't that become a little bit up to interpretation?
Rather than diving into the details of the words, what we want is, if I'm right, is if an element has got must support on it and I'm a requester of that information and somebody has populated a field with must support on it and I don't want to do anything with it, I'm unable to do anything with it, then I'm entitled to ignore it, but I'm not entitled to send an error back to the supplier of the information saying this resource was in error because you populated that field. That's just not an option for me. But
well,
then
you can't technically even because you're actually the end of the request.
Yeah.
You're
But
not
I
the
mean,
responder, you're the requester. So there is
so
no way.
So I'm the
to do that.
requester, it's come to me. So if I was to raise an error on that, I'm the only person who'd know about the error.
Mhm.
So we're sort of, I mean, this winds up being an
again, if you dive
obligation
in,
on private behavior rather than obligation on public behavior.
if you go into the specifics around this, and there are notes around what the user can do. So no error. It does, I may not have it here, but if you go into the page further, it does talk about displaying errors to the users, etc. It is in that dot point, sorry. Applications are still able to inform the user that a value cannot be processed correctly and may ignore the data. So it does say that. And if it's in violation of business rules, it can also tell the user that. But you're right, the responder will never know what's happened. But keeping in mind, this is a little bit more around validation of our profiles, not about how systems behave. It's just more about their obligations when receiving this data.
Given we're rolling the user into these descriptions and informing the user, when we say things like raising an error, it may not be immediately obvious whether that is raising an error with the user or raising an error with the FHIR endpoint.
Absolutely, there's lots of ways of raising errors, logging, etc.
No, I'm more saying about raising it, because you raise it to something and it's not clear who you're raising it to. Like,
and that's not the business of AU Core. I'm now bringing my Danielle out. So there's only so much that AU Core can dictate here. And all we're trying to really say is, as a client, you should be able to accept all of these elements.
but I guess the question I've got is, given we've now introduced the things like applications are still able to inform the user that a value cannot be processed correctly, is that an appropriate, do we even need to say that? I mean,
Well,
they may not.
It's
but
clarification notes. It is under the notes section of this definition. The definition part is this part. This is just to help clarify what does that mean. So as Richard's saying, we need clarification. Well, this is the clarification part about what it means, what kind of errors we're talking about. Now, if there's concerns about this clarification and its wording, then we need to go back to FHIR itself.
So rejecting so thinking of this as the rejecting element, I'm a requester. I've received this piece, I've received a resource. The resource has an element, includes an element which has must support on it, which I'm unable to process, which I have some problems with. So I'm not able to say this resource is unprocessable. I will just fail to process it and not present it to my downstream services. But I am able to, in a sense, annotate this resource and say to put a comment and say to my downstream resources, this resource has come and some bits aren't what I like. Is that the sort of thing that we're saying here, that the no error means if you get it and it's got some must supports that you don't want to use, you can't give up. You've got to do something useful with it.
It is, I think the first part of what you were saying, I'm not quite sure that I agreed with.
I'm trying to, in a sense, phrase what I think you're after. And if it's not what you're after, then I'm still confused.
Yeah. So again, this is about interpretation, trying to get common understanding. So my interpretation of this is pretty much as per the bolded part. The bolding is mine. I think they're the critical items that basically, if an element is must support, then the client should do its best in receiving that resource, accepting that resource without an error. As it starts processing it, then there may be reasons for it to error, and it may interpret those errors and present them into a user, put them into a log, etc. But they've accepted the resource. So in other words,
you can't error it as being unprocessable. You're allowed to, having received it to process, decide that there's some things that are difficult to operate on, but you can't reject it before you start to process it.
You can only really reject it based on business rules. Yeah. So the fact that there is an element there that you cannot process, you should not reject. But you should be able to at least then do things like logging, present it to a screen that you've not been able to display something correctly, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Sanjeev's got his hand up.
Sorry, Heath, I know what you said, how applications handle is something beyond AU core, but what about conformance? How does the first point in bold mean from a conformance perspective?
You can prove that your system has accepted the resource and then gone into a processing stage and have then raised errors because you cannot process it in the way that you want to, in your terms, handling it, then that's okay. All right, so handle is the next step. Without error, then handle, and then something very specific such as display. So if you've accepted without error, now you're trying to handle it, and there's a business rule associated with that, then you've aligned with this obligation. So how do we prove that? How do you prove that in a conformance situation? That's work to be done in the future when there is a conformance program. But this is providing the minimum obligation requirements for a system at this point in time, not a conformance requirement. Marvin? Sorry, Michael.
I think Michael's first.
Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a really good point that we seem to be focusing on the conformance focus here, but I think the intent for us at the moment is making sure that systems are designed and built around these must support sort of elements, right? That if you've got so much there to build against, you can't possibly think of every variation you're going to get. And this is focusing on making sure that these ones that are tagged with this, make sure my system can handle these, and in whatever way that may be, but not so focused at the moment about conformance, about how I prove conformance, how I prove whether I errored or didn't error or not. But it's more about providing that focus when you're designing and building systems, to making sure that at least these obligations you can process.
And I mean, this is, my background is sort of more of a .NET, and the terms that they use in .NET is unhandled exceptions. It's almost, and I think it probably in a HTTP sort of scenario, we're talking about an unspecified server error. Now, I know that we're not servers. This is in the context of a client, but if a client fell over with some sort of unhandled exception, and I guess as maybe a single page web app, for example, if there was a JavaScript error that is just hidden away from the user and just hung, then I would argue that you have not satisfied your obligation. But if you were able to accept that, present the fact that there was no reference to a valid resource, then you have satisfied this, because you've moved from the point of accepting with no error to handling. Marvin, did you put your hand down?
No, I've still got it. My take on this is from a client's perspective. If the spec says that you, for conformance reasons, you should be able to accept any of these 4 items in the reference, but you only handle one of those, then from a conformance perspective, you probably failed. In a similar way that if you were testing your application and you were testing that you received these types of messages back from a server, you'd want to put in that, oh, I've received a type and that was all I got. Therefore, my application should still work and shouldn't fall over, but you know, you'd have to put something in place to do that. So I don't think that it's a big stretch from how we build and test systems at the moment.
Andy?
Could you go back to, we're just talking about the on-error one, right?
Yes.
So that initial statement around being able to accept the resource without error makes complete sense to me. It's the notes that are confusing me. I don't like the first one because it begins the examples when you, I think, give an example, it indicates that this is in, but I'm not really sure what's out at that point. And I don't think the concept of rejection is a useful concept in this realm. When you described with your .NET hat on, that, you know, the way this is, I received this resource, you know, the whole thing doesn't fall over. That makes complete sense to me. But when you introduce a concept of rejection, that would tend to indicate that what I've received, I'm rejecting back to who sent it to me. And that's not, I think, what we're implying at this point. So how does a client reject in a FHIR sense? I understand how a server rejects, but a client rejecting, I don't know how that happens.
Yeah, you raised this a couple of weeks ago. Again, maybe there's some suggestion on better words around that, but what we're kind of, I guess, saying here is that if something is invalid, and we've moved away from, over here we're talking about you have to accept valid values, right? So if a reference had a valid identifier, but you're expecting a reference, you still need to be able to accept that resource. But now we're actually talking about, well, it's an invalid format of an identifier, such as the identifier type was not properly specified, then you can reject that. But again, yes, there's no,
but you can't reject. I mean, that's the whole point. Is that,
well, you can to your user.
Oh yeah, you can, but you're not rejecting to the user. You're simply, and you may inform a user, hey, I've just received something, and we're not going to do anything with it.
Yeah,
and that's fine. But that's, I think, if you introduce rejection in this client-server relationship, you're just kind of creating a whole bunch of confusion, because most normal people, when you receive something and they say you need to reject this, your immediate expectation is, I go back to who sent it to me and say, I am not accepting that.
okay.
Can I
I think that's
say, yeah, it sounds like Andy, that's a really good point. Do you have some suggested words that we could give that feedback back to the FHIR standard? Because I mean, we can put that in and get them to change this.
Well, just keep in mind, on the left-hand side is actually
like,
AU core. On the right-hand side is FHIR. So that I don't see any rejection on the right-hand side.
You
There is, you
There is
highlighted it.
in bold.
You highlighted it. Applications aren't able to
Okay,
reject.
sorry, you're right. Yes, there is.
I think if you remove that first example, the first note, I'm really good. And I think it makes complete sense. And we just have to get in this mindset of, this is about a client who's receiving something, you can't fall over.
So
Full stop, done deal.
Would something like fail or something be better? Sorry.
Yes, much better.
Gracefully handle a response it can't process.
Yep, that'll make sense.
Okay, I think we've got through that. Any other questions on this?
I'm just warming up.
Michael?
I was just going to say, it also implies there's a user, right? That same one, right? Who's to say there is a user?
Yeah,
good
keep
point.
in mind, this is just trying to clarify the first actual definition.
Just with wording,
right.
Like adjusting the wording and removing that point.
Yeah, but I think they're giving examples here.
Yeah, I think that's the
Otherwise,
problem though. The examples do lead to expected behavior, right? And
go out on a limb here and go, hey, Michael, do you want to take an action to have a look at maybe suggesting some better wording to the FHIR standard?
Sure. Yep.
Awesome.
Maybe
Let's
with
take that.
Andy.
Yeah. I'll run it past Andy before.
Sounds good.
But I mean, that's at least the second time that Andy's sort of rejected the rejected term. Okay. Where were we?
Ruben?
Yeah, look, I've probably missed something in the previous meetings which I hadn't attended. But if we could just go back a slide or two, Heath, where you actually talk about obligation extensions.
From which
I
actor?
think it was in the requester.
Mhm.
Yeah, here we go. Where you say when a profile requires a more tightly stated obligation of a must support element, the obligation extension is specified. I'm interested to know what more tightly stated means, and if there is a case where the obligation applies but the extension isn't used, why that's the case.
So I guess what I'm proposing here is that our must support definition for AU core by default is equivalent to the obligation no error. And the first part, those dot points are kind of paraphrasing the definition of no error as per the FHIR standard obligations. The more tightly stated ones are some of the other codes that are available in the obligations, such as handle, display, persist, print, ignore, such as those down in the bottom there. So they are the examples of what we could state. Now, whether we would or not in AU core, we haven't got to yet, but by default, we're saying it's no error, and we've now got a mechanism to be able to state something more specific rather than having to put no error on every individual element.
Yeah, I guess that's the part I'm not understanding. Why is that undesirable?
Last week, I did present an undesirable, what I feel is undesirable, where it becomes extremely verbose in the profile. I don't have that slide in my pack today, but
so that's it, verbosity.
An effort. I mean, basically, someone's going to have to go through every element and put these extensions on every element in every resource within AU core. Now, we're not saying that we're not going to do that, but it's more about, I see it potentially being a presentation thing so that we could actually put it in the capability statements into the profiles as and potentially hide them if they are equivalent to no error.
The capability statement doesn't help profile only implementers.
So
and
I shouldn't have used the term capability statement. It's the profile.
Well, I guess I'll go back to what you presented last time. Okay.
Sorry, I was correct, because AU core requester is actually an actor of a capability statement. So profile only doesn't have a capability statement and is not defined here as an actor. So we are actually talking about these obligations in the context of a actor which has a capability statement. This is AU core requester. It is AU core responder that have capability.
Fair enough. But there will be must support for profile only implementers as well. And it's them that I'm concerned will not have this obligation extension for no error.
I think that's
they definitely won't, and shall no error wouldn't apply to them, because shall no error requires system behavior. You need a system actor for that. So it wouldn't apply to profile only.
Okay, so leaving aside profile only, and let's stay within the realms of requester and responder, I still maintain that having that extension there is valuable because it provides machine readable expression of the obligation. And you know, if it's really just down to verbosity or work, then I think we can work through that. I just don't want it accepted, or at least without discussion, that that's the ongoing position.
Yeah, and I think that's okay, but I think it's also the matter of saying, okay, what is the default when we're talking about simply must support? What do we actually mean? And
the default I would propose there, Heath, is that must support implies that there's one or more obligations.
That's not how FHIR states that. And
well, everyone, hang on. So FHIR doesn't say what you must do with must support.
does.
Every IG decide. No, hang on. It provides the framework, but it doesn't declare items as must support, and it's up to IG authors or standards orgs to actually define what it means.
So there was a slide that I presented last week that actually said what FHIR states about must support, and obligations are in addition to a must support, but an IG must define either as narrative or in other definitive terms, such as obligations. So you can use obligations, but you don't have to use obligations.
Sure, I agree with that. And my feedback in the balance was that we must use obligations where we use must support. Now, I know we haven't obviously landed a position. That's what all these meetings are about. But I think that having things annotated as must support without associated obligations is probably not the way I'd propose we go.
And I think that's a separate discussion, but it's
Sure,
again, what we're trying to do is understand at the moment, what does must support mean for those that we've actually defined. And
may I rephrase that slightly? I agree with what we're doing. I think this is right, and I think we are agreeing on what the obligation is, whether we're using the obligation extension or just using the narrative description of it.
Yeah.
And so the work we're doing now it puts us on a pathway to using the obligation extension if we want. It doesn't stop us from doing that, because we are trying to understand what the obligation is.
Yep, agreed.
And we're trying to understand what the default obligations we think they are the default actually means in certain circumstances. So a complex element, etc. So this no error is the base absolute minimum capability for our client. Sorry, obligation. So anything other than no error is stronger than no error. So if we can't even agree that no error is the base obligation of must support for an AU core requester, then we've got a bit more work to do.
Can we ask now? Oh, sorry, go, Stephen.
What do you mean by any obligation other than no error is stronger? What about the ignore? The ignore, to my understanding, is far weaker than no error.
Well, that is actually not as per the obligation value set. So the obligation value set or code system actually has a hierarchy. It starts with no error. There is then a level 2, which is handle. And then there's another level 3, which has these that I've got down the bottom: display, persist, print, ignore. So ignore is actually a subtype of handle. Handle is a subtype of no error.
Yeah, exactly.
In an ontological sense. Richard?
I just wanted to comment that when you're doing stuff about reject, on the left-hand side, you've got may reject invalid resources. So that's a use of reject in the AU core terminology, not just the international FHIR stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought Andy was referring to, but I did miss it amongst all the words on the right. Okay, are we good to move on a little bit further? I think that was worthwhile discussion though. It is really tricky from a client perspective, I go admit. And I think what I'm trying to actually show you here is exactly that. It is tricky. And as Sanjeev said, there is an element of more obligation on the client, even though it's simply that they have to know error, they do need to be able to accept more elements or sub-elements.
I think you almost said handled there.
That's why I paused. Okay, so moving on to optional elements. And I think my text might be a bit of a copy and paste error here. No. So for an optional element that is must support, that is missing, shall not include an element in the resource returned as part of the query response when the option is element. Is optional, sorry, element is optional. So from a requester perspective, it's just not receiving something. So I guess there is no equivalent to that responder. They don't know that it was missing, just didn't get it when it's optional. However, when it's mandatory, the responder shall be able to indicate that the data is missing. And the requester must be able to process those resources or accept those resources when there are missing data elements or suppressed data elements. So what does that mean in this particular example? Oops. I thought that I had an extra bit. So for missing data, you need to, and with a required binding, as is the case for status, you need to use the appropriate unknown concept for a coded element. So if the value set does not have an appropriate unknown concept, you must use a concept from the value set. Otherwise, the instance is non-conformant. And there's actually a number of examples of that in the FHIR specification. I won't go into that any further. But in this particular case, there is an unknown. So that's our obligation in this particular case. If there is missing data, we simply mark it as unknown. It's a bit of a contrived example status, but I think there is some interesting discussion in the context of procedure or a procedure status, because I don't think there's a lot of systems that would actually record through a user interface the actual status of a procedure, that it is completed, for example, or not done. So what would we actually provide as the status if there is no explicit element stored for a procedure?
Well, surely if it's historical and and you know it is, then you're populating completed.
Right. So but you've made an assumption to do that.
Yes, I don't know if we have implementation guidance specifically stating that, but I'm fairly certain there is general guidance on how you
And I think that's very
Yeah.
reasonable. It makes sense, right? So I think you can derive it if you can, but if you can't, I guess what this is saying is, well, you got a fallback. You go to unknown. So if you can't derive it, not sure, it's unknown. Something that's probably a little bit more useful is procedure code. And I guess this starts getting into the potential case of perhaps not necessarily missing data, but suppressed data. And this is an extensible binding in particular, but it also works for preferred or examples bindings. If the system has text but no coded data, then we just simply provide text only. But if there's neither text nor coded, then the appropriate unknown concept should be used if the binding strength is present, is extensible or less. If the value set, such as SNOMED, does not have an appropriate unknown, then we use the data absent coding system as with an example in this particular case. So is there any questions on that?
Not yet. I suppose at some point we'll get to the refinement I want to do about this particular one, this particular element, but I think we should leave that to another meeting. But I think that's right.
Can I just ask a question about how this is assumed to manifest in validation derived from an implementation code? If I have created something that inherits from an implementation guide that inherits from AU Core, and that's now running in my server, the obligation that you talk about for must support, so a client, a requester is sending me some data, where does that validation, is this going to be defined within the implementation guide such that it would pick up all of those attributes of there is a existing value within this attribute, so the missing data stuff is taken care of, there is not, so you as long as you include this other thing, or am I going to have to do something else?
So I think as a downstream, and I guess if we talk about e-requesting as a potential downstream system, profile, sorry, I would expect that you could, or you could keep it as open as what we have in AU Core. It's kind of down to the implementation level. Again, I use the example of SNOMED. Although there is things like unknown in SNOMED, it's probably not part of the value set of procedure as per AU base. So we have, in this particular case, we have no option other than using the data absent code.
So isn't this going to make conformance non-deterministic?
Don't know if it's non-deterministic, but it's probably in subjective. Ruben?
Look, my comment was separate to what Andy's was asking about. So if you feel you've ended that conversation, it was really just a simple query following on from a discussion I had with Danielle, and that is, do we need a new obligation that says if something is mandatory, we absolutely want a value and we don't want missing data to be supported? I just want to get a general view if that's something that we think will be desirable for some things in AU core.
I think a standard pattern for such an obligation would be a useful thing to have. I'm not sure whether we would want to use it in AU core, but it would be nice to have it as a agreed piece of semantic machinery that people could use in their
Yeah.
own specific ones if required.
I agree. It would need to be done at the international level anyway, because these obligation types are in a required binding value set.
I think there's a case for that if the profile doesn't even make sense without it.
Yep.
Right. So it's, I think there's definitely a case where you would want to say you must have these things, otherwise there's no point sending it, because there's not enough information there to make any use of it.
But that stuff can be done just by profiling data types generally. So for instance, one that some of the agency profiles have is, if you send a reference, then you will send a reference or an identifier or a text. And that one says, basically it says, you can't just send me a reference type, which has no useful information in it. So you can do that sort of thing by having profiles of data types.
But say we take procedure status. What's the point of sending it if you don't know what status is? It shouldn't be allowed to.
Well, you have to. So that's I was going to respond to Ruben and saying, well, we can set the binding strength to required. Now we have to send one of those 8 values or whatever is in that list.
But missing data
on procedure status, you could say, in my particular profile, I've bound to a smaller value set which excludes the value unknown.
You could, yeah.
So I suspect that what Ruben suggested can be done by using other constraints.
Well, I'm not sure that it can be in the case of something like code, because you wouldn't want to make that required. And as it's currently stated here, because it's an extensible one, then AU core is effectively saying, if there is no unknown concept in your value set, because you've constrained down your value set, then there is still this option of technically using the data absent reason code system. So
you could prohibit that in your profile.
I'll just say, outside of code, going to your example, Richard, on which you said, and then the agency one says you can have one of these 3 elements. Any of those 3 elements could be sent as missing data using the extension.
Yes. Yeah, and so you then have to dive in even deeper and say, and don't use the missing data extension on any of those elements. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
We've only got 1 minute left, guys.
I was just going to say, I think we're
I'll put my hand down.
Well, we've got time for yours, Marvin. I don't really.
Oh no, this was just extended on that to, for example, if let's say the agency were to create their own IG for uploading to my health record, and they wanted to mandate the use of the IHI, is there a way they could do that? Is that an example of how that might be done?
Sorry, mandate the use of what?
IHI.
Yeah, I think that's a great use case for something like this.
Yeah. That can be done. It says, basically you've got to have a value and you can't have an excuse. That can be done.
So maybe I'll very briefly close out this section, and this is, and I realize we won't have time for comments, but basically the final thing around mandatory elements is for non-coded data. Subject is an example of this, and if we have to suppress this data, then or it's unknown, then we have to use an extension. So the data absent reason extension is now used because it's not coded to be able to give us the unknown code of data absent. There is this second dot point, which is of interest, But it is a U core that mandates a child element. So we're talking about within the reference. If it was mandated that the reference element was mandated, then we're in trouble. But if we've got no mandatory sub-elements, then the extension is allowed. So I guess I've got a lot more slides, and if anything, these were the simple ones. They get even more complicated going forward. So I guess we're back here again next Friday, unless people don't think this is useful.
Well, I think I vote for Andy to bring the beers next Friday.
It's not 4 o'clock yet, though. We have to shift the meeting.
We just
It is in
drink
New
on New
Zealand.
Zealand time.
Yeah.
It's 4
All
o'clock
right.
somewhere.
So we'll keep this conversation going in our next Conformance Friday. I'll see you guys next Friday. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Heath.
Thank you, Heath.
Thanks.
Bye.